First of all, thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Lisa Davis, and I'm the coordinator of the Care and Keep Ministry at the Brooklyn Baptist Church Northeast. And I just want to take a few minutes, if you would, and just bow your head with me. I just want to give thanks for this day and the opportunity for us to come together to learn about being prepared for emergencies. And we bless those who've been able to join us and for our speaker. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
I would like to introduce our speaker, Scott Phillips. Scott Phillips works for the Midlands Region Bureau of Public Health Preparedness at the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, where he manages and provides training for over 300 volunteers as the Public Health Reserve Corps Coordinator. Prior to working with public health preparedness, Mr. Phillips spent 5 years with the Environmental Health Program at DHEC in vector-borne disease surveillance. During his tenure in environmental health, he was the recipient of the Michael D. Jarrett Outstanding Customer Service Award and the South Carolina Environmental Health Association New Sanitarian of the Year Award. Mr. Phillips obtained his Bachelor of Arts and Master of Public Administration from the University of South Carolina. He recently completed his Master of Arts from West Virginia University in December. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Phillips currently resides in Columbia with his wonderful wife, Marie, and their 3 children, Bryn, Kaylin, and Wyatt.
You got it.
Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Greetings to everybody. Lisa, I'd like to thank you once again for allowing me to talk about family disaster planning. It's something that I really take seriously and love to talk about. We are living in a slightly different world than we've been used to, but we are now fully into hurricane season. So I think this is great and timely for me to be talking about family disaster planning and everything that goes into it. So a little bit about me beyond what Lisa talked about. I'm originally from the Philadelphia area, and I've been living in South Carolina for 20 years. And growing up, I did have a lot of dealings with snow and ice, but it wasn't until I came down here to South Carolina that hurricanes and other disasters were happening. And I'm very, very glad to be here today to talk to you guys about that. This is a little bit different for me because I'm usually a little bit more animated when it comes to doing these presentations. So if you start seeing me talking with my hands or what have you, I'm just looking for eye contact with you guys as well as looking out, because I normally try to have eye contact with a lot of people when I do these presentations. So this is new to me. So hopefully this comes across as very informative, but I can still try to make it slightly interactive. So next screen, Donna, please. So some of the topics that we're going to talk about today is being prepared. We want to make sure that everybody who's listening to this knows how to be prepared for disasters in their community as well as across the state. Learning the plan for those, that's one of the most important parts of it. You can be prepared, but if you don't start that planning process, you won't be as prepared as you can be. And finally, be informed. And when I mean be informed, it's not just watching the Weather Channel. There's a lot of other things that go into being informed and making sure that everything you need to do in order to react to those natural disasters are done. Donna, next slide, please. So we're going to take a look at being prepared. When a disaster strikes, for instance, if we have a hurricane or a flood, and normally I ask people whether or not they've had a disaster in their community before. I'll go ahead and I'll ask all 3 of you here. What type of disasters have you guys had that you've had to deal with if you've been living in South Carolina for a while?
Mine was Hurricane Hugo.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? How about the floods of 2015
Oh yeah.
Yes,
or
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I
okay,
just put
all
that
right.
in the chat box, the flood. Yeah.
Gotcha. That was probably the biggest one for me. And if I was not prepared to actually respond in that, and it wasn't just because of my job of working in preparedness, but I understood after all these years that you need to make sure that you prepare, because if you're not prepared, then you could be a little out of luck with some things. And when I say that, in 2015, when we had the flood event, about 3 o'clock in the morning, my weather radio went off. And when that weather radio went off, it was dark in my backyard and it said there was a large aerial flood that was happening. So I flipped on the back switch and my backyard no longer was a small creek. It was a raging river. So that was the first time that I really understood why I needed to be prepared, because I woke my children up. I went upstairs, I grabbed my go bag, which we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we left because we had to evacuate because I wasn't sure how high the water was going to come up. So when that happened, there's a possibility that you may have something happen to your dwelling and you may be on your own for 48, 72 hours. So if a disaster strikes your community, you may not have access to food, you may not have access to water, and you may not have access for electricity for some time. One of the biggest examples was when they had the Hurricane Irma and Maria go through the Caribbean. Puerto Rico had some issues. There was about a year that some people did not have electricity in their houses. Think about it. If we have electricity go off because of thunderstorm, you're upset if you have no electricity for a couple hours. Could you imagine not having electricity for up to a year? So understand that there's a possibility that when a natural disaster strikes, you may not have food, water, or electricity for some time. And if you think about it, you need at least 2 quarts or a half a gallon of water each day. You also need enough water for food preparation and hygiene. And when I say hygiene, if you lose your water supply, what's one of the things that you may not be able to do? Flush your toilets. You may not be able to take a bath. You may be able to prepare food, but it may be in a fireplace or on a stove of some sort. So you need to make sure that you keep enough water so that you can eat and also be able to eat food. Have food and hygiene. So until the water systems come back up. So you need to at least store a half a gallon per person per day. That seems like a lot of water, but if you are out of water for a week, you're going to want that extra water somewhere in your house. I have a pantry, if I could show you on my computer, to my kitchen to my left, that I have 3 things of water stacked up just for preparedness wise, bottles of water. And you want to store at least that 3-day supply for each member of your family. In some cases, if you're unable to store this much, store as much as you can. That's the big thing. If you have a large family like I do, that's 5 people. That's a lot of water. And if you can't store it, store as much as you can, because you have no idea how long you may possibly be without electricity, food, or water. And don't forget to take your pets and service animals into account. So when we talk about food and we talk about water, make sure you have enough dry food or canned food that you can use a pop top for. And we'll talk a little bit about why you need pop tops or other type of materials in your house for cans, because you have to make sure that your pets are taken care of as well. Donna? So a little bit earlier, I talked about making a kit. Making a kit, or like what I like to call is a go bag. There's a couple things that you want to make sure that you have in your kit. You want items for infants. Obviously, you're going to have to store not just water, but maybe possibly formula or other type of food for infants, especially if it's a newborn. You want to make sure that you have, if they're not breastfeeding or what have you, that you store enough for the infants. Items for seniors. You would think, well, what difference really is that? Well, for some seniors, it may be food that's soft to the palate. It may be a special diet. So if they're on a special diet, I know that my mom's in a nursing home, And I actually, because of COVID, haven't seen her since March. Before she went into the nursing home, she was on a specialized diet when she lived with us. So we had to make sure that we had enough food for her. You can't just give somebody who needs to have really soft food a steak that you can prepare on your grills. You have to make sure you take not only the infants in your house, if you have any, but any type of seniors that you have in your house as well, and make sure you have enough for them too. Portable radio or television and flashlight. Normally when I do this in person, I show everybody a portable radio or television and flashlight, but what you can do is you can go to a sporting goods store or something like that, or you can even go on Amazon or Yahoo and get wind up flashlights. They're little flashlights that you wind up, and instead of having to worry about batteries, you can actually go ahead and take these portable radios or televisions and a flashlight and wind them up so that you don't have to worry about replacing batteries with them. So as part of a kit, you have to take into consideration how much you can store, and then obviously change of clothing. When I left my house in 2015 in my go bag, not only did I have some of the things that I'm gonna talk about in a couple minutes here, but I also had extra clothing, because when I left my house at 3 o'clock in the morning, it was like a shower outside. And by the time we got to the hotel up the street, we all had to change clothing. People don't think about that. They think about other things, but you have to make sure that you have enough clothing that you can change into it, because you may be in a hotel or somewhere else without access to washing machines or dryer for a little bit. So you want to make sure you have extra clothing with you as well.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
are we putting all of these things in this go bag in a plastic bag?
You can, and that's one of the things that we can talk about a little bit, is that when we make these go kits, we want to make sure that we have them so they don't get wet. So you can put everything into a Ziploc bag, and then you can put them into a large plastic container or a waterproof bag that you can carry with you. It depends on the size of your family. I had 2 bags actually when I left with my family in 2015 because of the floods. But in some cases, you can use a large, I'll use my hand, a large Ziploc plastic container that you can put everything in depending on the size of your family. So yes, you want to make sure that it is waterproof, weatherproof. So it would be a good idea to put that stuff in a Ziploc bag, or as much as you can, because you never know if you don't get to where you're going and you're outside for a little bit. You want to make sure you don't have a way of inundating everything with water or what have you. So yes, that's a good point. And lastly, and not least, but a first aid kit. Everybody forgets about this. When people go and they leave their house, you still can have nicks, scrapes, cuts that you want to take care of. And in some cases, you may not even be able to get out of your neighborhood. So you want to make sure that you have a first aid kit. One of the greatest examples of that was, and Donna, you mentioned Hurricane Hugo back in 1989. I used to work with a gentleman in vector control that was here in Sumter in 1989, and he could not leave his neighborhood for 2 weeks because of all the fallen trees that were down. So when he was clearing debris, his son, who was, I believe he said either 10 or 11, was helping him remove a tree, and he cut his hand. They couldn't rush him to the hospital, so they had to rely on that first aid kit to make sure that he was taken care of. So make sure you have a first aid kit and you replenish everything inside that first aid kit, because some of that stuff obviously over time can go bad. You want to make sure that you have enough material in there in case somebody gets hurt. And then there's an example of a first aid kit right there. So other essential items. Normally I'll ask people, what are some of the other things that you want to put in a go kit? But go ahead, just go through. There's going to be 4 pictures on the screen. In the upper left-hand corner, you have to take in consideration your children. If your children are in a hotel or in an unfamiliar place, or heaven forbid you're in a shelter, like an American Red Cross shelter, bring games, card games, board games. Keep your kids entertained, because for them, you know, my kids, when we had to leave in 2015, they were a little freaked out because they were smaller. So we wanted to make sure that we had stuff to keep their mind off the fact that they didn't know if they were going to go back to a house or not. They didn't know how long they were going to be in that hotel. So make sure you bring stuff for the children, and really for the adults too. You want to try to have as much normalcy as you can while you're dealing with the disaster. Upper right-hand corner, hygiene stuff. Make sure you grab it in your kid's toothpaste, toothbrush, dental floss, anything hygiene related that you need to bring, because again, you may not have access to anything, so you want to carry as much hygiene stuff as possible. Bottom left-hand corner, money. I always ask, why should you keep a stash of cash on hand? Because if there's no electricity in your community, if there's no electricity where you're going, it may be only cash only. So even if it's $20, $40, make sure you have a little bit of cash on you so that if you have to go out and buy anything, you can use that cash rather than trying to use your debit card or what have you if there's no electricity. Gas stations are notorious for losing electricity for posting signs saying cash only. So make sure you have cash. And then lastly, on the bottom right, prescriptions. If you don't take your prescription medicine with you and you don't have a doctor's note or your doctor's not in the office, you may be hard pressed to actually call a CVS, a Walgreens, a Walmart to get extra prescriptions. So make sure you have your prescriptions with you as well. And if they have to get refilled, then you have the doctor's telephone number and everything like that, and you can provide that to the pharmacies. So these are some other essential items that you would need. My question for you guys is, what's some other stuff that you think you could put into a go kit? What's some of the other stuff that you think that you would need?
Maybe some snacks of some sort, especially if you have kids.
Right.
I think it's also important to probably have not just your medication, but maybe like a medication or a list that also talks about maybe like any kinds of conditions perhaps that you have.
Right.
If you have a pacemaker and you don't have a bracelet, or like your physician's number,
Right.
any other kind of medical information that might be pertinent in case of a medical emergency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else?
Chargers.
Phone chargers. Very good.
Any other chargers you may need?
Phone chargers, iPad chargers, anything like that, electronic wise. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say maybe birth certificates and social security cards, or is that needed?
Absolutely. That was going to be my next point. Any important documents, and again, Lisa, this goes back to a Ziploc bag. You can put copies of your social security card, in some cases, your wills, your insurance information. When I left my house, I was worried whether or not I was going to come home to a house because the water in my backyard was really, really high. Now, I didn't lose my house. I lost my HVAC unit, but I carried all those important papers in there because if I had to do an insurance claim and I couldn't get into my house because there was water inside my house, then I may have to wait a little bit, or I might have floated away or what have you. So all of your important documentations like that is extremely important. So yes, those are all great examples. Donna, you can move on to the next slide. All right, so even though you're prepared, let's make sure that you have a plan for disasters. And families can cope with the disasters by preparing in advance and working together as a team. Now, when we were all younger, in our younger days, what was one of the things that people used to do in school that they still do now that prepared you for a disaster in the school? Fire drills.
Fire drills.
Guys had to do fire drills. I remember doing fire drills growing up. My mom used to talk all the time. She's the one in the nursing home. So she was in school during the 60s and the 50s when they had to do the bomb drills where they had to get underneath their desks because of what? Cuba, Russians, Cold War was going on. So they used to do that. In some places in the country, they do tornado drills where they get underneath their desks, especially in the Midwest. And now today, because of the world we live in, we have active shooter drills that we do. So just because we do that at schools doesn't mean necessarily that we shouldn't be doing it at home. And that is something that's very important. You have to make a plan and you have to practice it. And you've got to create that family disaster plan, including a communication plan and evacuation plan. Now, in your house, you would think, why do you necessarily need an evacuation plan? Well, in some cases, if there's a fire and your kids are upstairs, you don't know whether or not you're going to be able to get your kids out. They need to know how to get out of the house from the second floor if they're not able to come downstairs. So we actually have an evacuation plan where on our downstairs, we go out one door and my children who are sleeping upstairs can go out another door upstairs. Knowing what to do and how to do it is your best protection, and it's your responsibility. Just like DHEC is responsible for doing plans to protect the citizens of South Carolina, family members have to have a responsibility in the planning in your house to make sure everybody is safe. Donna, go ahead. So what if a disaster strikes? What type of disasters are most likely to happen in your area? Well, we know living here in South Carolina, one of the biggest ones are hurricanes. In fact, right before I jumped on here, I was watching the Weather Channel. I think they said there's seven systems right now that could potentially impact the United States or south of us here in South Carolina. That's 7 systems. So if you haven't started doing your planning already, it's a good time to start doing it right now. But what other type of disasters could you plan for? I've already mentioned one, tornado plans, and we also talked a little bit about flooding. But what other type of disasters could potentially happen in South Carolina that you would need to plan for?
We just had one, earthquake.
Very good. Earthquake. There's a huge fault that's down in Somerville, down 26, and earthquakes, just like tornadoes, there's not much that you can do because it happens in an instant. It's not like a hurricane where we can plan that out 5 days, or as we were talking about earlier, a snowstorm. We kind of have an idea if a snowstorm is going to happen, or even a large amount of rain. But tornadoes and earthquakes are not something that you're going to get a lot of warning about. And there's a lot of planning. Where do you go? What type of communication plan do you have? There's a lot of planning that goes involved in those disasters that happen instantaneously. Another thing we always fail to talk about, and this is really, really smart, and I always try to I talk a little bit more about this, is find out about the disaster plans at your workplace, which hopefully you do, your children's school or daycare center, and other places where your family spends time. So for instance, are you aware of where your children may go if there's a disaster at their school? Again, one of the things I hate to talk about, but we have to, is active shooters. If there's an active shooter event at a school where your children are, where are your children going? My children are going across the street to a gas station at Cardinal Newman, and for St. Peter's downtown, they're going to the Richland County Library. So I know that that's where I would need to go, because you're not going to go to the school. If something happens to the school, you don't need to go to the school, because what's that school going to be? It's going to be a crime scene, or it's going to be inaccessible. So you're not going to go to that place to get your children. You got to go to those alternate places. So it's a good idea to know about what's going on with your children's school or daycare. What about a family member that's working? Say, for instance, you have an older child and they're at work and a disaster strikes. Does that place have a plan in place? And if so, you may want to know a little bit about it, because if your daughter or your son's working at a Publix or is working in a restaurant and something happens there, you may not be able to get a hold of them. You need to know exactly where they're going or what that workplace is going to do. Is there going to be a meeting place? When we do active shooter drills, each workplace has a designated place that those people need to go. In some cases, those businesses, if something happens like a tornado or what have you, there's a place for those employees to go because they can't stay in that facility because it could be compromised. So another way of making sure that you have that plan in place is to know, is to make sure you know about your own workplace, your children's daycare or school, and other members of your family, possibly where they work. So when it comes to communications, and this is really smart to start when children are young, is to post those emergency telephone numbers by phones. And I know that we live in a world of everyone's got a cell phone. Nobody has a regular phone, rotary phone, or what have you in their house, but you can post that on your refrigerator. Make sure you have those appropriate telephone numbers, not just 911. You don't want to flood something 911 if it's not an emergency, but we have a local police station up the street from our house, and we have their telephone number posted on our refrigerator. Also, fire and EMS. If you have local numbers, rather than just calling 911, post those. Teach the children how and when to call 911 or your local EMS number for emergency help. They don't necessarily have to call 911 all the time, but if you tell them this is what you need to call or who to call when something happens, they can even put it in their cell phones. My daughters have cell phones, and they have emergency numbers in there in case they need to call at the drop of a hat. And then post that phone contact with a designated family member or friend who is unlikely to be affected by the same disaster. So if you have a neighbor, that neighbor may be affected by the disaster on your street in your community. But if you have a friend that lives across town or a friend that lives a little bit further out where you don't live, it's a good idea for them to have that telephone number, because they may be able to come take the kids, or you may be able to go to them and say, hey, this is what's going on. Can I come to your place as a safe haven? So make sure that it's somebody who is not in an area where you're going to be affected. So for instance, we have two friends. I live in the Irmo area. I have a friend in Blythewood who my daughters have their telephone numbers. So if we ever needed to go anywhere, that's where we would go, because more than likely there's a good 15, 20 mile difference. If it's a tornado or what have you, it hopefully isn't going to affect them, and we can go there as a safe place. Donna, next. Okay, so a little bit about evacuation. We kind of touched on this, but determine the best escape routes from your home. Obviously, if there's a fire in your house or you have a flooding event, you may not be able to go out your front door. You may not be able to go out your back door. You need to find another place that you can go to escape from your home. And if you have children that are living upstairs in a bedroom, they need to know how to get out from upstairs and not come downstairs, especially if there's a compromising situation with the house, such as a fire or a flood. You don't want them walking into that disaster. Find the safe spots in your home for each type of disaster. So a tornado is going to be a little bit different from a hurricane. Tornado is going to happen instantaneous. You're not going to have much of time to react to it. But a tornado and a hurricane will do similar damage. As we all know, if you're in a tornado or a hurricane, you go to the middle of the house, you don't go near a window. But when there's a fire, you don't want to hunker down. You want to get out of the house as quickly as you can. So if there's a fire in your house and you can get out, great. But if you can get downstairs, if the fire's upstairs, to get to a safe spot so you can get out so everybody's accounted for, that's a good idea too. But most of the time, especially with something such as a fire, you just want to get out. So just make sure you have a plan in place for whatever disaster it is. And I know this sounds a little bit silly, but just as they do in school, conduct fire and emergency evacuation drills. If you have small children, you may want to make them aware of, if we start yelling or fire, or you heard the alarm go off, like this morning when I woke up, I realized the battery in my fire alarm was starting to go because my fire alarm started beeping. So if they hear that fire alarm going off, they need to know, oh my goodness, there's something going on in the house that we have to leave for. And if they have a plan in place, it's a lot easier for them than to just sit in their room and wait for somebody to come, because there's a possibility that somebody may not be able to come and get them immediately, and they need to have action on their own. So make sure you practice those. And then when you have to evacuate and you get out of your house, keep fueling your vehicles. So for instance, when we had the flooding event in 2015, I had gas in my vehicle because if for some odd reason I couldn't get to a gas station and I had to go further than the hotel up the street from my house, if I had no gas, what was going to happen? I'd be stuck on the side of the road in the middle of a torrential downpour, not knowing if water is coming anywhere near my vehicle. So make sure that you keep fuel in your vehicle in case you actually have to leave your community. Go ahead, Donna. Okay, so one of the things that we always try to talk about is whether or not generators are safe to use. and how to use them. Yes, generators are great. You could be without electricity for a long period of time, but there's some safety issues when it comes to generators. First of all, never use a generator in your home garage or basement. Reason being, noxious fumes. If you have a generator because your electricity is off and you bring it inside your house and you start to run it, you're going to have more issues than just not having electricity. So never use in your home garage or basement. Next. Always use outside, away from doors, open windows, and vents entering your home. Some people think that it's okay just to take the generator and put it out on their back porch or on their side, by their side door. Those fumes can enter the house really, really easily, and you won't even know it until it's too late. So you make sure that you put that as far away as you can from any place in your house, because you don't want those fumes coming into your house. And then the carbon monoxide is the primary killer when it comes to generators. You can easily get a carbon monoxide detector at a Home Depot or at a Lowe's and put it in your house. That's good not only for the use of generators, but if you have anything else electrical in your house or that uses gas in your house, because if that goes off, you're not going to smell the carbon monoxide. You're not. So you want to make sure that you have that in your house if you have any type of generator usage going on during an emergency or anything else in your house that uses fuel. Go ahead, Donna. So when we put this together, there were 3 different websites that I took this stuff from, and I wanted to put it up there because there's a lot more information that I could talk about beyond what I just did just now. FEMA, DHEC, and ready.gov are 3 exceptional websites to go to learn a little bit more about family preparedness. Ready.gov is really great because they actually have templates to create a family plan. So if you want to go ahead and start doing a family plan, if you already don't have it, go to ready.gov. And then FEMA and SCDHEC have some great resources as well. So does anybody have any questions?
So I do.
Yes, go ahead, Lisa.
So this year has been an unprecedented year because of COVID-19.
Right.
And we know that sometimes during the hurricane season, people have to evacuate and go to shelters.
Correct.
Do you know what that will look like this year? Because I don't imagine, I'm not sure, how we would shelter people with COVID-19. Or would they be screened when they go in a shelter? Will that look differently this year?
It will. And from a DHEC perspective, one of the plans that they put in place was, with COVID still being an issue and we don't have the vaccine yet, and with those 7 systems out there, if there was a mandatory coastal evacuation, everybody would be coming obviously inland. And there's no way that you could put 200 people into a shelter safely, regardless of mask use or social distancing. So one of the plans that they have in place right now is to use hotels. Our planner, Tamala Johnson, has actually reached out to a lot of the hotels in the Columbia area, and that's where they're going to go. They can put a family into a hotel room, but you can't put non-family members into a shelter or into a hotel room together. So there'd be individuals going into hotel rooms. And I foresee that happening at least until the end of hurricane season, because even if we get a vaccine, there's no way that we're going to be able to open up those large shelters, those population you call them general population shelters. There's no way that we'd be able to do that with COVID, because it would be a huge mess.
Yeah.
You know, you already worry about outbreaks in shelters just for people sitting there. Imagine having 50 to 100 people in a general population shelter. That spread would just be ridiculous. So hotels right now are the biggest thing.
And I remember in the past, we've had to evacuate people from hospitals and even nursing homes. And so when you think about the coordination that takes, or that took in the past, and COVID-19 on top of that, it just resonates to me a little bit more, the urgency for people to have a plan. and understand, that it's a different year.
Yes.
And so to me, there's a different sense of urgency.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. And that question actually came up back in June, just as hurricane season was starting. Someone brought that up, and that planning just took off because we knew we couldn't put people, just because of the way COVID is, there's no way that we would have been able to screen people and then be there for a week unless we did it every day. The manpower would just be exorbitant. But they thought, hey, if we can just put them into a hotel room where we wouldn't have to worry about non-family members getting together, then it wouldn't be an issue. Because if they're in the family together, that's fine. But if you take two non-family members and put them into a shelter, they have no idea who they've been around, how long they've been around somebody, and if for some odd reason that person leaves before the other person does, are they going to be able to go find that other person? Contact tracing is hard enough as it is. So that's why they decided to go with hotel rooms. Great question.
Yeah. But I was just thinking about having to evacuate people from a nursing home, and we've done this before, right?
Right.
And now, we have people in nursing homes with COVID.
Yeah.
And I think in the past, they've had some reciprocal relationships, maybe with other nursing homes to take individuals. I'm just wondering how much more complicated is that now, because, we do have people in nursing homes with COVID and now trying to transport them elsewhere.
Right.
Again, there's just so much more planning that has to go into things this year.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's been absolutely horrendous because, planning for evacuations in general takes up a lot of time. But when you add the COVID portion to it, it just complicates it. When you have nursing homes that are on the coast that come up to the Midlands or to the upstate, there's usually sister facilities. So that's easy, but if you have a population that that there's COVID in that nursing home, and then you're bringing it to another facility where there's not as much COVID going on, what do? Are you going to have to go ahead and open up a wing for the people coming from the other facility that they have COVID? Are they all going to stay? I mean, it's just really, really complicated. And I wish that I could have an answer for you on that because I'm not part of that planning with the nursing homes, but it just complicates the whole situation. My mom's nursing home has COVID right now, and she was put in quarantine for 2 weeks. I couldn't imagine taking those people who were active and putting them into a bus or what have you and taking them someplace and then putting them into another facility and potentially causing a spread there too.
And this will be my last question. Earlier you talked about storing water and the amount of water you have for your family. Do you rotate out that water?
Yes, it's a good idea. Normally water has an expiration of about 2 years. Now it's still potable after 2 years. And to be honest with you, I've had water that was expired 6 months later and it was still okay. But yeah, I normally try to rotate that water out as much as I possibly can. I don't necessarily, you don't have to do it every 2 years or every 1 year, depending. But you want to make sure it's not sitting there for 3 or 4 years, because if it's in a plastic bottle, then it picks up the stuff that's actually in the bottles, and then that could be ingested, and that becomes an issue. But yeah, rotate everything out. Canned goods, make sure you don't have stuff that's canned goods that's been sitting there expired, because you don't want to get somebody sick if they're sitting in a hotel room or sitting, in their car because they can't get to a hotel room and then they can't get to a hospital. Make sure anything that you have in your go kit that you're going to take, you rotate out. You don't want it to be expired. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, I believe, Donna, the last slide has some of my contact information on there. Oh, okay. I thought I had my contact information on there. Well, Lisa, are you going to put this on someplace where you can put all my contact information on there?
I think so. Or if you want to update it and add one more slide.
Yeah, I can do that. I'm sorry. I thought that there was a pop-up at the bottom that had my contact information, so I apologize. I can definitely do that for you tomorrow and send it to you and have all
Okay,
my
that'd be
contact
great.
information. And then if anybody has, after they view it, has any questions, they're more than welcome to contact me. You know where to find me, so it's not a problem in case anybody does.
Yeah. And so, Scott, again, I do want to thank you for joining us. I think of you as a annual speaker for us. So thank you. And I think maybe the first year that you spoke to us, we actually had the pandemic kits. Do you
Yes,
remember those pandemic
yes,
kits? And we actually handed those out to the people who came to the session.
yes.
I had a woman, a member, who reached out to me a couple of months ago, and she said, "You know what I found?" She said, "I found that pandemic kit." And who would have thought, right, that we'd be in the middle of a pandemic?
Wow.
So it just goes to show you that, again, it's good to be prepared.
Yes.
Sometimes when you have things, you don't think that you're going to need them, but kind of timing is everything. And so I just think it's always good to be able to have these refreshers because we just don't know. We don't know what the next thing will be. So
Absolutely.
again, thank you. We appreciate you joining us and taking time from your evening.
Well, not a
So
problem. I enjoy it. I look forward to speaking to you guys, hopefully in person next year. And you're right with that. I remember doing a presentation where I talked about different preparedness things. And one of the slides I had was a picture of a flood event. And less than a year later, 2015 happened. And now I talk about that in retrospect rather than just saying this could happen. So I agree with you. You have to prepare because you never know what's going to come down the road. And the more prepared you are, the better off you and your family are.
very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Dewana. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Dexter, for joining us. And we will try to get this presentation posted. Thanks again, Scott. Have a good evening, everyone.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you.
You too.